Hey everybody, Joe Peluso here again from Complete Payroll, welcoming you back for another episode of PeopleWork. PeopleWork, of course, is the video series where we interview experts on a wide range of topics under the human capital management, human resources umbrella, all for the benefit of people whose job it is to manage a workforce or take care of people. Today is the second of a two-part interview we did with Scott DeLuca, who is a labor law attorney from the Kavinoky Cook law firm. The first episode was about the employee retention credit and a number of things involving that. Very, very informative and helpful. If you want to check that out, I will provide a link to it wherever you're viewing this. But now we want to get into the second part of the interview, which is where we talk about the various leave acts that were passed in response to the coronavirus pandemic, which we seem to be sort of coming out of, but are still very much in, and everyone's still being very careful, which is great. Scott is an expert on this stuff, and he was very happy to come on and be very generous with both his time and with his knowledge. And we were super grateful to have him. And I think employees and employers are going to get a lot out of, certainly both of these interviews, but this one in particular. So very happy to once again present Scott DeLuca from the Kavinoky Cook law firm, discussing the various types of COVID leaves. So enjoy. All right, Scott, we're good. All right. Thank you so much again for coming back. For those who haven't seen the video that we did earlier on the employee retention credit, why don't you just give people a brief sort of overview of who you are, where you're from, and some of your credentials. Why should they care about what you're saying?
Well, I appreciate that. Joe. I'm Scott DeLuca. I am a senior counsel at Kavinoky Cook, a law firm in downtown Buffalo. I've been practicing labor and employment law for 23 years now in Western New York and throughout New York State and across the region, representing my clients in litigated matters and counseling them as they may need. There's pretty much anything in the labor and employment or employee-employer relationship falls within my realm. I'm a 1998 graduate of New York Law School, but I grew up in Western New York, and I returned home in the late 90s when it was a new thing to come back to Buffalo from out of town. I'm admitted in the state courts of New York and federal courts throughout New York State, the western half of Pennsylvania, the Second Circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court, which is what you see behind me here today. So I try to bring my experience representing clients in the labor and employment area, and hopefully we can bring some of that knowledge to bear today for everybody's help. Yeah,
and so far so good, man. The employee retention credit video is super helpful, and we're hoping that people are finding it helpful. And I'm super happy to have you back on to talk about another aspect of the sort of relief that's been going on, and that is the COVID vaccination leave that New York State just passed. Just to start with, just the top level, what is it? How long? When was it passed? Et cetera, et cetera.
So it was proposed early this year, and it was enacted by the state legislature in early March. But specifically, it was signed by Governor Cuomo on March 12th of 2021, and it became effective immediately. And that means as of March 12th, employees of any size employer were entitled to up to 4 hours of leave, 4 hours of paid leave, if they were going to get a COVID-19 vaccination of any kind. And it's going to apply whether the employee is getting the first dose of Pfizer or Moderna or any other future 2-series shot, or the 1-shot J&J or any future 1-shot vaccination. So it's per time that you have to go for the vaccination.
Right. And so, okay. So they would get 4 for each. That's great.
Yes.
Does this count against PTO or like any sort of other like sick leave type of thing?
Yeah, no, this is an independent right. So if you are getting a shot, you can take the paid time off and your employer has to pay you out of their funds, but they cannot charge you against PTO or any other benefit, including paid sick leave under New York state law. None of that is to be None of this time is to be counted against any other paid leave entitlement. Unless you're in a union and there's a collective bargaining agreement that specifically addresses something like this, then it may be counted against them if it was collectively bargained and negotiated and is in your contract. Otherwise, it can't count against any other benefit plan.
How does this affect like labor law posters or like other sort of, like there's always the huge wall in like the break room where you got to post all the
next
stuff.
to your time clock where you put all the labor law posters. Yeah, there is no posting requirement for this one. They're just kind of relying on people hearing about it through the press or otherwise. So an employer does not have an obligation to advise their employees of this right. But they don't need to keep it a secret. They shouldn't hide it from them. If somebody asks about it, I think it's appropriate to answer the question.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's probably best practice to do so, right? To post about it, add it to a handbook or something like that, right? Like,
I don't know if I'd add it to a handbook because hopefully it won't be around for that long.
Right.
But letting your employees know you can, again, with so many people out of the workplace too, I don't know that necessarily posting it was on the forefront of the legislature's mind. So if an employee asks about it, I think you tell them honestly that they have the right to it and we will provide that benefit. But you don't have to go out of your way necessarily as an employer to advise your employees about the right to this leave.
So does this cover, I just got my second, I know you just also got your second dose. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yes, you too.
Yeah, thank you. So what, I mean, I know I was like a little, you had it seemed like a worse reaction to it than I did. But I was still a little like knocked out and groggy for a couple of days. Like what would be, I mean, if somebody has a pretty serious reaction and it puts you down for a few days, like, does this cover that? Or is it just for the time to go get the vaccine and get home?
It's only the time to go get the vaccine and then either return to report back to work or go home.
Right.
So if your time to get your vaccine is in the middle of your work day, you can go for a couple of hours to work, go get your vaccination, and then go back to work. Mm-hmm. Or if your employer is releasing you to go home and not return to work, they have that right.
Yeah.
So it does not provide an employee with paid leave if they're suffering effects from the shot after the fact. If you do have that situation, then you would have to use your employer provided paid time off, employer provided paid sick leave, whether it's the employer voluntarily doing it or under New York State's paid sick leave law, or any other type of benefit like that. If you have a family member that has it, I guess it could qualify under paid family leave if it was serious enough, if the complications were serious enough. So after effects are going to be paid sick leave or unpaid sick leave, depending on the size of the employer.
Okay. So, I mean, I know that these things are not supposed to, I mean, it's unfortunate that these things exist, but like, with things like this, or like, when you get time off for voting and stuff like that, or just in general, when people take advantage of benefits that they're entitled to, but, taking advantage is the same. Like often there's a little bit of, there's discrimination, there's, it's sort of unspoken, but it could, are there any protections in place for, I guess was what I'm asking, like for employees to be able to take this time in good and be, feel completely comfortable with it and stuff like that. Like to know that this is not something that's going to somehow come back to them officially or unofficially down the road.
The answer is that it shouldn't. So this law, like most of the paid leave laws that you've mentioned, voting, and there's a long laundry list of other paid leave opportunities in New York State law. It's not supposed to result in any sort of discrimination or retaliation against the employee for taking it. If you do face something like that, because this is a provision of the labor law, it would actually be something that you would complain to the New York State Department of Labor about. A lot of people think, I should go right to the Division of Human Rights, which looks at retaliation and discrimination based on sexual harassment or gender or race discrimination. That's not this law. So this paid leave law would be administered by the New York State Department of Labor. Additionally, or alternatively, I suppose if you really wanted to, an employee who is facing retaliation or discrimination could pursue a claim against an employer, but I don't know how much benefit that really is going to get them, because we're talking about a 4-hour leave, at best 8 hours of leave,
Right.
that an employee is entitled to. And keep in mind also, for the employer's benefit, it's up to 4 hours, such that it needs to be sufficient time for an employee to go from one place to get the shot and go to the next place. So leave work, get the shot, go back to work, or leave work, go get the shot, go home. It's not supposed to be necessarily 4 hours. So if an employee is taking the leave and they are abusing it, an employer is allowed to discipline if the employee is abusing it.
Sure.
But I would want to have very solid evidence of that abuse before I took that action.
Yeah.
I don't want to be accused of discrimination or retaliation for doing that.
Exactly.
It's not something I would encourage, but it is, an employer can stop abuse.
Okay. So, so that's for the vaccination.
Yes.
That's literally just for vaccination stuff. So there is also a leave policy in place for for contracting or having COVID-19 still, right?
Yes, there is. In New York State, so there's two tracks here. There's the federal leave requirements and the New York State leave requirements.
Okay.
And the federal ones technically expired at the end of 2020. So on December 31st, your right and the employer's obligation to provide paid leave because of COVID-related issues ended. But they have created a tax credit for the federal leave programs, and that is now continuing until the end of September 2021.
Okay.
So even though an employer is not required to provide those leaves, it can, and if it does, it may be entitled to tax credits.
Okay.
So we can talk about the federal one in just a moment, but there is an existing current leave requirement under New York state law if you qualify. And it is a very specific reason why you would take that paid leave.
Well, what's that reason?
You have to be subject to an order of quarantine or isolation by the Department of Health. I almost said Department of Labor, by the Department of Health. So if you test positive, you're going to get a quarantine or isolation order. If you are part of a large exposure event, you might get an order of quarantine or isolation. But it's only if you have that order that you are entitled to paid leave under New York state law. If you wake up one day and you're symptomatic and you haven't been tested and you haven't spoken to the Department of Health, you're not entitled to paid leave under New York state law.
Okay.
Under the COVID law.
And you'll get some sort of, you'll get some sort of documentation from the state.
Yes, you would.
Then you provide to your employer.
It would actually be from the local, probably your county department.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
And so if your doctor, early on in the pandemic, there was difficulty getting these orders for quarantine. So technically the law says it's supposed to be from a local Department of Health, but they issued guidance that allowed doctors to issue an order of quarantine that needed to be adhered to and qualified under this law. That guidance still exists, but I think that the Department of Health has a much better handle on issuing the orders of quarantine and isolation now. So that's going to be an employee's best bet. But it is a document that can be provided to an employer, and that's what triggers the obligation to provide paid COVID leave.
Okay. So what is the obligation then? What does it entail?
It's going to depend on the size of the employer. And by that, I mean the number of employees. So there are, in essence, 3 categories. So the first one is if you have 10 or fewer employees and you are what's called a low net income employer. And by that, I mean in the previous year, you had net income of less than $1 million. So if you are a small, under a 10 or under employer and you're a low net employer, then your obligation is only to provide them with the time off that they need because of the quarantine or isolation order. There is no paid benefit that is required. However, that employee may and should apply for New York paid family leave and New York disability leave, because there were enhanced benefits that were passed as part of this legislation.
Right.
That is not money that's going to come out of the employer's pocket. That is money that would be paid by your paid family leave insurer and your New York disability insurer, which should be the same company. So it's the insurance companies that are going to pay that benefit, and it's better than it normally is. Normally, New York disability is $178. Under this law, it's a much better benefit. So an employee should apply for those benefits, and the employer only has to provide them with the unpaid time off while they're quarantined or isolating, and then they do have to bring them back. So that's the employer's real obligation. If you are an employer that falls in the mid-range category, so you have 11 to 99 employees, or you're a small employer, 10 or fewer, and you had net income of more than $1 million in the previous tax year, then you have to provide up to 5 days of paid leave for the employee because of the quarantine or isolation order issued by the Department of Health. That's going to be money that comes out of the employer's pocket to pay that. And it's just going to be 5 days of whatever the employee's regular rate of pay and the regular wages that they would earn for those 5 days that they are off. After the 5 days, then the employees who work for these employers are also entitled to New York paid family leave and New York disability, as I mentioned, for the small employers as well. Yep. So you get the paid leave from the employer, and then you can get this other benefit if you're still on the quarantine order. Excuse me. Then you have the large employer category. So that's going to be 100 or more employees. If you fall in that category and you're looking to see for everybody, the employee count is as of January 1st of 2020. So you look at that date, how many employees do you have? That's where you qualify. So it's not the number of employees you have now, it's what you had on January 1st of 2020.
Okay.
If you have 100 or more employees, then you have to provide 14 days of paid leave if an employee has an order of quarantine or isolation from the Department of Health.
So the entire length of the quarantine, really?
It probably is.
Right.
It's possible that a quarantine could go longer if you continue to test positive, but it was designed to protect an employee and provide them with paid leave for the entirety of the quarantine period, yes. If their quarantine period is longer than the 14 days, then that employee can apply for paid family leave and New York disability, just like for the smaller level employers.
Right. Okay.
But this would be the same thing in terms of the amount of pay. It's going to be the employee's regular wages, regular wage rate for what they would have earned for those 14 days that they would have worked. So that's all of the employer categories under New York law. It sounds like a very onerous requirement, and it is if you're a large employer, but keep in mind, just waking up and having COVID symptoms, if you're the employee, that's not enough. You got to actually go test positive and then get a quarantine or isolation order. It's only when they have that order that the employee becomes entitled to the paid leave time off.
So I guess talking similarly about what we touched on at the end of about the vaccination leave, what sort of penalties or consequences would an employer face if they were to, I guess, like hold it against someone for taking advantage of this leave? Like when somebody what guarantees are there to workers when they're coming out, when they're, their quarantine's done, everything's fine, they're ready to come back to work? How safe are they to come back?
Sure.
Like in terms of their job security, rather. And then,
and that is the whole point of the law. And that an employer's obligation is to bring back the employee and restore them to the same position with equal pay and benefits at the conclusion of the quarantine period. If an employer doesn't do that, in this situation, there is no mechanism for enforcement technically, other than a complaint to the Attorney General. And that's honestly something that an employer really should not want to have to deal with.
I gotcha.
That the state was very adamant about putting out there early during the pandemic, and I guess during the mid part of the pandemic. So I'm going to say between March and June or July last year, they were adamant that employers that felt that they were being treated wrongfully
Yeah.
not just poorly, wrongfully by their employers, to contact the state attorney general's office, and the AG's office would go out and enforce this requirement. I have not personally heard of any employers that have been sued for violation of this.
But yeah, I was going to ask if there was any horror stories.
I don't have any horror stories on this one, and I think that that's good. And I think that part of the reason for that is because employers are not necessarily holding employees responsible if they test positive,
right?
Because it could happen to anybody at any time. It could happen at work. It might not happen at work, and you never know. So I don't have any horror stories that I can share on this front, which I guess is good. But the Attorney General's office will vigorously investigate these types of issues, and I have seen that. And in essence, they will force an employer's hand and force them pretty much to bring the employee back and put them in the place that they would have been. And if the employee was out of work for quite a period of time, I would imagine that the Attorney General's office is going to push them to not only reinstate, but provide them back pay for that period. I don't have any specific evidence of that, but I'm pretty comfortable in thinking that the AG's office would vigorously pursue something like that.
Yeah, I would think so too. I would hope so.
Yes.
What if somebody they test positive, because not because they felt symptoms, but because they were at an event that they were worried, or somebody near them got it and they just wanted to check. They weren't feeling symptoms and they tested positive. They were asymptomatic, and generally, so they were positive, but they didn't have symptoms, and they could basically still do the same job from home. Like this was basically the case of what happened to me when I had it back in last summer. Right.
Me too, but without having it, but yes.
Right. I mean, I did. I mean, I was symptomatic for like a day or two, but I was largely able to do whatever my job from home. Right. So what, is there any sort of like, what happens in that instance, I guess, is my question.
There is a carve out in the statute. So if you are an eligible employee, so you have an order of quarantine or isolation, but you're able to work from home and you're asymptomatic, and you do, so if you have those three situations, you're actually not entitled to the leave. So it's dependent on the employee having a qualifying quarantine or isolation order, being deemed asymptomatic, and actually being able to do their job from home, like you and I have been doing for quite a while now. In that situation, in that limited situation, the employee is not entitled to paid COVID leave, and they would presumably just keep working and doing the employer's work, and get paid in the normal course as they normally would as an employee performing a job. So there is a carve out for an asymptomatic person who tests positive. And as we know, that has been the case for many people, and the state recognized that. So they've made this carve out for that situation.
Okay. So is there any, what else do employers need to know about either type of leave that we've talked about?
Well, we've talked about the COVID vaccination leave, yep. And we've now talked about what happens under New York state law if you have a qualifying quarantine or isolation order. The question that I opened up this paid leave discussion with is also federal leave. And as I mentioned, and that's leave that was actually provided under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, yep. Which was passed in March of last year by Congress. As I mentioned, mandatory leaves under that law expired on December 31st of 2020. But through the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was signed by President Trump in December, that leave was extended to March 31st, not the leave, but an employer's can provide the leave and get the tax credit for providing that leave through the end of March, based on the law that President Trump signed. And then President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act that extended the tax credits even further. So now they're available all the way until September 30th of this year. So employers are not required to give what I call FFCRA leave, but they can. And if they do, they're entitled to the tax credit that's available now until the end of September.
So can you talk about that credit and what it is and who's eligible for it?
So the tax credit itself is going to be a dollar for dollar refundable tax credit for any of the leave types that are provided by the FFCRA. And there are actually 8 different leave types. And we can talk about those in a moment. But the key thing about the tax credit itself is that it is a refundable tax credit. So what that means is if you're a qualifying employer, you're going to get a full credit back for any of the sums that you overpaid on for federal taxes on your tax credit. So on your 941 form, you're going to get a full credit back. And this is going to be for small to mid-size employers. So that's going to be employers with fewer than 500 employees. If you're in that situation, then you can get this tax credit under the FFCRA for providing this paid time off.
Okay. So yeah, then let's talk about the different, let's go over the 8 different types of leaves that
Sure. So there are 8, and these 8, what they mean is that an employee is entitled to up to 80 hours of paid sick leave if they are a full-time employee. So in essence, 2 weeks. If you're a part-time employee, you're entitled to 2 weeks at whatever the proportion of hours is that you work. So if you work 20 hours a week, you're entitled to 40 hours of paid leave for any of you. So it's not just a straight 80-hour shot.
Yep.
It's 2 weeks is what it is. So you're going to get this if you are subject to a quarantine or isolation order from any governmental entity. You're going to be entitled to this if you've been told by your physician or a healthcare provider to self-quarantine because of the coronavirus. If you are experiencing symptoms of the coronavirus, so but because you have the symptoms, you are entitled to this. If you're caring for a person who has an order of quarantine or isolation because of the coronavirus, or they've been told to self-quarantine by a healthcare provider, then you're also going to be entitled to this paid leave. If you are caring, and this would have been much earlier in the pandemic, it's a little bit less so now. If you're an employee who is caring for a son or daughter who is stuck at home because their school is closed or their childcare is closed, you're entitled to this. If you're an employee who is experiencing symptoms that have been recognized by the Department of Health or Human Services, then, or any other condition that may be identified by HHS, then you would also get this. There were 2 new characteristics or qualifications that were added by the American Relief Plan earlier this month. If you are obtaining and or recovering from a COVID vaccination, then you can get this paid leave. So where the New York State COVID leave provided 4 hours of leave to get the vaccination, this federal law allows an employee, if an employer is providing it, to provide an employee with paid time off that the employer can then get a tax credit for. So if you're getting the vaccination or you're recovering from it, or finally, if you're seeking or awaiting a test result when you've been exposed to COVID-19 and the test has been required by the employer, in that situation, you can also get up to 2 weeks of leave under the FFCRA. There's a separate category. So those are what's called the emergency sick leave, emergency paid sick leave provisions.
Okay.
There was an expansion of the Family and Medical Leave Act that was also part of this FFCRA. And that was primarily to allow people to take time off if their children were home from school or daycare. And that provided an additional 10 weeks or a total of 12 weeks of leave in that situation. That law is still in effect. And so if you qualify for that, then that benefit can be provided, paid by the employer, and then there's a tax credit available for that as well. Earlier on last year, when this was much more prevalent, there are specific financial limits for each of the first 6 categories in terms of how much money you would owe an employee, or if they're taking the expanded Family and Medical Leave Act. All of those limitations, that's what the tax credit is going to be limited by. So if you do decide to provide this benefit, you should definitely talk with someone like myself, a labor and employment attorney, or your own personal counsel, or your accountant, to make sure that you're providing the benefit that you can provide that you can get the tax credit for.
I was going to say, it seems very simple I mean, it seems pretty simple for an employer, right? Or an employee rather. So it's like, if you're, I mean, anything COVID related, you're pretty well covered in terms of get yourself better. Obviously like the nature of this whole virus is like, if you,
isolate, stay away.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, which is, I mean, great. I mean, I wonder how this, and this is maybe a topic for a future thing, but like, I wonder how this pandemic is going to affect leave as we know it. I know, I mean, shortly before this, I feel like a lot of companies were going to sort of a more, like a trust-based leave system where it was like unlimited, but like, within reason. And I wonder if this will affect stuff like that. It might change how employers approach sick, employees being sick,
I think you're
right. Risky now.
I think you're right that it could have an effect. I know that there has been a push. Recently in the news, President Biden has been pushing that there's going to be some sort of social welfare package that the news is reporting will probably be proposed next month. And among those things is a paid leave program.
Like a federal one.
A federal one.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what the specific idea is going to be, but the suggestion is something like a paid FMLA program. And that is possible because, again, according to the news, and I don't do this research myself, we're one of the few first world industrialized nations that doesn't have a paid leave program available for families. Because the FMLA program is the FMLA is unpaid leave unless you combine it with some other benefit. So I think that you're right that there is the possibility that something could grow out of this. There is a push to make paid leave part of federal law. And I think that you'll see that. I think that you're also right that in a professional setting, a lot of employers have moved to a trust-based leave system where an employee doesn't have a set period of or amount of time that they can take paid time off. But the employer is going to work with them and provide them with a paid time off benefit. And if it becomes abused by an employee, then the employer can take action against them and say, you can't take any more time off. And if you do, we're going to have to deal with that, and there's going to be consequences.
Yeah.
So I think in professional environments, you see that. In hourly work environments, you see a lot less of that. It's still a very regimented program. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it seems simple for employees, but for employers, it sounds like another, it's good, but it's also complicated. Like we were saying previously, like people want to make pizza. They want to, they want
to do their job.
Right. They want to do right. Exactly. So, this type of stuff is, I mean, it's again, why someone like you is such a valuable resource.
Well, I appreciate that, but I think you're right. Employers want to conduct their business, and employees want to do the work that they were hired to do.
Yeah.
And that's my approach to how I do the work that I do for my firm. And so, and I think that's the approach that a lot of employers and employees find themselves in. And so I think that you're right about that.
Yeah. So all right. So again, tell people how to get a hold of you and who should get a hold of you.
Well, I provide the wide range of labor and employment law services to my clients and clients of the firm. So people can contact me by email at rsdeluca@kavinokycook.com. And I know Joe's going to put this information on the screen, and I appreciate that. So my email, rsdeluca@kavinokycook.com. But I'm on my cell phone constantly, and I can be reached at 716-481-8216. And that's the best way to get a hold of me. And I help employers of a wide range. I have large institutional clients, all the way to mom and pop restaurants, the wide range. I grew up in the restaurant business, so I know that industry very, very well. And I miss it sometimes, but I enjoy what I do, and I enjoy getting to work with a wide range of clients like I do nowadays. And so I welcome the chance to work with you and your organization if you need some help.
Of course. Well, help. I mean, you've been such a great help, helping us sort of make this stuff digestible for people. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this with us, and look forward to helping you clarify future labor laws for me down the line.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I look forward to coming back and helping you guys, helping all of us understand a little bit better what we see with these labor laws in the future.
Excellent. So yeah, get a hold of Scott if you have any questions about this stuff, which I'm sure you do, because I certainly do myself. But again, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to doing it again with you soon.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Joe.
All right. Take care, sir. All right. So once again, that was Scott DeLuca from the Kavinoky Cook law firm discussing COVID leaves. This is the second of 2 consecutive interviews we did with Scott. The first, of course, concerning the employee retention credit. And there will certainly be a link to that wherever you're watching this. We're very appreciative of Scott. He's been very generous with his time and with his knowledge. And as he states in the video, he has included all of his contact information. So if you do have any questions for him, or if your organization would like to possibly employ Kavinoky Cook to help navigate these sorts of things, very helpful with that as well. So I will certainly include all of that information wherever you're watching this. If you have any questions for us, or if you'd like to submit a topic for a future PeopleWork episode, or if you'd like to volunteer yourself to be a guest on a future PeopleWork episode, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us. It's peoplework@completepayroll.com. There'll be a link to that below as well. But in the meantime, thank you again so much for your time and for watching. And of course, welcome to Payroll Country.
Thank you.